In 53 BC, the richest man in Rome led 7 Roman legions into the desert of Mesopotamia. 40,000 soldiers, the finest infantry in the world, veterans of campaigns across 3 continents. They marched under the eagles of Rome, those sacred standards that had never been captured by any enemy, that represented the power and honor of the Republic itself. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the commander, was 62 years old and desperate for military glory. He had more money than anyone in Roman history. He had political power. He was one of the 3 men who effectively ruled the Roman world. But he didn't have what he craved most, a military reputation to rival his partners, Pompey and Caesar. He was about to get something else entirely. What happened next would haunt Rome for generations. In a single afternoon, at a place called Carrhae, the Parthian Empire did something no one had done since Hannibal. It annihilated a Roman army. 20,000 Romans died. 10,000 more were captured and marched away into slavery in Central Asia, never to return. Crassus himself was killed, his head cut off, and sent to the Parthian king, who was watching a performance of a Greek tragedy when it arrived. According to legend, the king used Crassus's head as a prop, filling his mouth with molten gold as a commentary on Roman greed. And the eagles, those sacred, invincible symbols of Roman power, were taken. For the next 3 centuries, Rome would try to avenge Carrhae. Emperor after emperor, general after general, would march east seeking to crush the Parthians once and for all. They would win battles. They would capture cities. They would briefly occupy territory, but they would never conquer Parthia. Rome conquered Gaul. Rome conquered Britain. Rome conquered Egypt, Greece, Spain, North Africa, and the Balkans. Rome conquered everything it seriously tried to conquer except this one kingdom beyond the Euphrates River. Why? That's what this story is really about. Not just the battles and the emperors, but the deeper question: what made the Parthian Empire different? What was it about this particular enemy that Rome, for all its power and all its persistence, could never quite defeat? The answer will tell us something important, not just about ancient history, but about the nature of empires themselves, their limits, their blind spots, and the enemies they're not built to face. To understand why Rome couldn't conquer Parthia, you first need to understand who the Parthians were. And that story begins in one of the great empires of the ancient world, Persia. For over 2 centuries, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, had been the dominant power in the Near East. It stretched from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. It was vast, wealthy, sophisticated, and seemingly invincible. Then Alexander the Great arrived. In just 13 years, Alexander conquered the entire Persian Empire, smashing its armies, capturing its capitals, and incorporating its territories into his own vast realm. When he died in 323 BC, his generals divided the spoils. The eastern portions, Mesopotamia, Persia, and the lands beyond fell to Seleucus and became the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids were Greek rulers governing Persian subjects, and the arrangement was never entirely stable. Over the following century, the empire gradually weakened, losing territory to breakaway kingdoms and internal conflicts. Around 47 BC, in the northeastern corner of the Seleucid realm, a nomadic Iranian people called the Parni seized control of the province of Parthia. Their leader, Arsaces, founded a dynasty that would bear his name, the Arsacids. For the next century, the Parthians, as they came to be called, expanded steadily, taking advantage of Seleucid weakness to absorb more and more territory. By the mid-2nd century BC, they had conquered Mesopotamia, Persia, and much of Central Asia. They had become a great power. But they were a very different kind of power than Rome. The Parthian Empire was built on mobility. The Parthians were originally steppe nomads, and they never entirely lost that character. Their society was organized around horsemanship, archery, and the vast open spaces of the Iranian plateau. Their army reflected this heritage. The core of Parthian military power was cavalry, specifically two types that would become legendary. The first was the horse archer. Parthian horse archers rode small, fast horses and carried powerful composite bows that could punch through armor at considerable distances. They fought in loose formations, circling enemy units, showering them with arrows, never allowing themselves to be pinned down or caught. They were masters of a tactic that would terrify their enemies, the Parthian Shot. A horse archer would pretend to flee, drawing pursuers after him. Then, twisting in the saddle, he would fire arrows backward at his exposed enemies, accurate, deadly shots delivered while riding at full gallop. The phrase Parthian Shot may actually derive from this maneuver. The second type of Parthian cavalry was the cataphract, a heavy shock trooper armored from head to toe, riding a horse similarly encased in metal. The cataphract carried a long lance called a kontos, over 12 feet long, designed to punch through enemy formations with devastating force. Together, these two cavalry arms created a tactical system that was extraordinarily difficult to counter. The horse archers would harass and weaken enemy formations, forcing them to either stay in tight defensive positions where they could be worn down indefinitely or break formation to pursue where the Parthian Shot would destroy them. When the enemy was sufficiently weakened and demoralized, the cataphracts would charge, shattering what remained. It was a system perfectly adapted to the flat, open terrain of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau terrain, where Roman infantry had no advantages and plenty of vulnerabilities. Rome and Parthia first came into contact in the early 1st century BC as both powers expanded toward the Euphrates River. The initial encounters were diplomatic rather than military. In 96 BC, the Roman general Sulla met with a Parthian ambassador, and the two powers established the Euphrates as an informal boundary between their spheres of influence. Rome would dominate the Mediterranean world. Parthia would dominate the lands beyond the Great River. For several decades, this arrangement held. Both empires had other concerns. Rome was consumed by civil wars, slave revolts, and the struggles between Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar. Parthia was dealing with its own internal conflicts and pressures from Central Asian nomads. But the boundary was never going to be permanent. Both empires were expansionist by nature. Both were drawn to the wealthy territories of Armenia and Mesopotamia. And both had ambitious men who dreamed of glory won in foreign conquest. The man who shattered the peace was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the most fascinating and frustrating figures in Roman history. He was phenomenally wealthy, the richest man in Rome by a wide margin. He had made his fortune through a combination of slave trafficking, real estate speculation, and what can only be described as protection rackets. He owned fire brigades that would arrive at burning buildings and refuse to put out the fires until the owners sold him the property at a discount. He was also politically powerful. He had helped crush the slave revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC. Though Pompey had stolen much of the credit by arriving at the last moment to mop up fugitives. He was one of the three members of the first triumvirate, alongside Pompey and Julius Caesar, effectively ruling Rome through informal alliance. But Crassus was consumed by insecurity. Pompey had conquered the East, defeating Mithridates and reorganizing the entire region. Caesar was conquering Gaul, adding vast territories to Roman control and building a formidable military reputation. Crassus had money and political connections, but he lacked the one thing that mattered most in Roman culture, military glory. He was determined to get it. In 55 BC, the triumvirate was renewed at the Conference of Leucas. As part of the deal, Crassus received the province of Syria and authorization to make war against Parthia. He was 60 years old, had no recent military experience, and was about to invade a vast empire he knew almost nothing about. His advisors urged caution. The tribune Aetius Capito reportedly stood at the gates of Rome as Crassus departed, calling down curses upon the expedition. The king of Armenia, Artavasdes, offered to provide cavalry and allow Crassus to invade Parthia through Armenian territory, a route through mountainous terrain where Parthian cavalry would be less effective. Crassus ignored everyone. He chose to march directly across Mesopotamia through the flat desert that was perfect for Parthian tactics. He was in a hurry. He wanted his glory, and he wanted it now. The campaign began badly and got worse. Crassus crossed the Euphrates in 53 BC with approximately 7 legions, about 35,000 infantry plus 4,000 cavalry, and 4,000 light troops. It was a formidable force by Roman standards, but it was composed almost entirely of heavy infantry, trained for close combat, with minimal cavalry support. The Parthian king, Orodes II, divided his forces. He personally led the main Parthian army north to deal with Armenia, which had been wavering between Roman and Parthian influence. He sent his general, Serena, south with a smaller force, perhaps 10,000 cavalry, to delay and harass Crassus. Serena was young, probably in his early 30s, but he was one of the most talented commanders of his generation. He came from one of the great noble families of Parthia, was fabulously wealthy in his own right, and had a reputation for military brilliance. He immediately understood that his job was not to meet the Romans in pitched battle, but to use mobility and terrain to neutralize their advantages. Crassus, meanwhile, was being led into a trap. An Arab chieftain named Ariamnes had attached himself to the Roman expedition, claiming to be a friend of Rome and offering to guide the army across the desert. In fact, he was working for Serena. He led Crassus away from the Euphrates, away from water sources and supply lines, deep into the barren desert. When the Romans finally encountered the Parthian army near the town of Carrhae, they were already exhausted, dehydrated, and far from safety. The battle that followed would become one of the most famous disasters in Roman military history. The Battle of Carrhae was a master class in asymmetric warfare. Crassus formed his legions into a massive hollow square, a defensive formation designed to protect against cavalry attacks from all directions. It was the textbook Roman response to enemy cavalry. Against most opponents, it would have been effective. Against the Parthians, it was a death trap. Serena's horse archers began circling the Roman formation, pouring arrows into the packed ranks. The Romans raised their shields, creating a protective roof against the rain of missiles. But the arrows kept coming, and coming, and coming. Roman commanders had seen horse archers before. Normally, mounted archers would run out of arrows relatively quickly, forcing them to withdraw and resupply. The Romans expected to weather the initial barrage and then advance to close combat, where their heavy infantry would be dominant. Serena had anticipated this. He had brought a camel train loaded with spare arrows, allowing his horse archers to resupply on the battlefield. The arrow storm would not stop. Crassus sent his son, Publius, with a force of cavalry and infantry to drive off the horse archers. It was exactly what Serena wanted. The Parthians feigned retreat, drawing Publius away from the main army. Once he was isolated, they surrounded him. The cataphracts charged. The Roman detachment was annihilated. The Parthians rode back to the main Roman army carrying Publius's head on a spear. The psychological impact was devastating. Crassus, who had been watching from the main formation, saw his son's head displayed before him. The soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized, lost whatever fighting spirit remained. But the Romans couldn't break and run. The moment they broke formation, the Parthian cavalry would ride them down. They couldn't advance because the horse archers simply fell back, maintaining distance. They couldn't stay in formation indefinitely because the arrows never stopped. They were stuck. As the sun set, Serena withdrew his forces. He didn't fight at night. Cavalry tactics required visibility. But he also didn't allow the Romans any relief. His forces surrounded the Roman camp, ensuring that Crassus couldn't slip away in the darkness. The Roman army was trapped, demoralized, and leaderless in spirit, if not in fact. Crassus, according to ancient sources, was in a state of shock, barely functional, unable to give coherent orders. During the night, the Romans attempted to retreat to the town of Carrhae, abandoning their wounded 4,000 men left to die or be captured. Even this retreat was chaotic, with units getting lost in the darkness. The next day, the Parthians resumed their pursuit. Crassus tried to negotiate with Surenna, hoping to buy time or find some way to extricate his remaining forces. Surenna invited him to a parley. What happened at that meeting is disputed. Ancient sources claim that a struggle broke out, that Crassus was killed in the confusion, that the Parthians never intended to negotiate honestly. What's certain is that Crassus died the richest man in Rome, the triumvir who had dreamed of matching Pompey and Caesar, killed in a desert far from home. His head was sent to King Orodes, who was at the Armenian court, celebrating a marriage alliance. According to the famous story, the king was watching a performance of Euripides' tragedy, The Bacchae, when the head arrived. In the play, the god Dionysus drives the women of Thebes to madness, and they tear King Pentheus apart. When the actor playing Pentheus's mother needed a prop for the severed head, someone produced the real head of Crassus. The Parthians poured molten gold into Crassus's mouth, a symbolic commentary on the greed that had brought him to their lands. It was a spectacular humiliation, and Rome would not forget it. The disaster at Carrhae shocked the Roman world. 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured. The sacred eagles, the standards of the legions, symbols of Roman power and honor taken as trophies. The head of a triumvir used as a theatrical prop. It was the worst Roman defeat since Hannibal had annihilated the legions at Cannae over a century and a half earlier. And unlike Cannae, there was no recovery, no revenge, no eventual victory. The legions were gone. The prisoners were never coming back. Some of those prisoners, according to later legends, were marched east to the borders of China, where they may have served as mercenaries and perhaps even founded a settlement. Modern historians debate whether these stories are true, but they speak to the sense of total loss that Carrhae represented. The prisoners had vanished into the vastness of Asia, swallowed by distances Rome could barely comprehend. The eagles were particularly painful. The loss of a legion's eagle was considered the ultimate disgrace, a stain on Roman honor that demanded vengeance. 3 eagles had been lost at Carrhae. Getting them back would become an obsession for Roman leaders over the following decades. But more than the eagles, more than the prisoners, more than even the death of Crassus, Carrhae revealed something deeply troubling about Roman power. The Roman military system was built on heavy infantry. For centuries, the legions had been the dominant fighting force in the Mediterranean world, defeating every enemy they faced. Macedonian phalanxes, Carthaginian armies, Celtic warbands, Hellenistic kingdoms all had fallen before the disciplined, relentless advance of Roman infantry. But at Carrhae, that infantry had been helpless. The Parthian horse archers had never allowed them too close to combat range. The cataphracts had struck only when the Romans were already broken. The entire battle had been fought on Parthian terms, using Parthian weapons, according to Parthian tactics. Rome had finally encountered an enemy it wasn't designed to beat. The immediate aftermath of Carrhae was consumed by Roman civil wars. With Crassus dead, the triumvirate collapsed. Pompey and Caesar, the 2 remaining triumvirs, turned against each other. The conflict that followed Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the campaigns in Greece and Egypt and Spain absorbed all of Rome's attention and resources. There was no capacity for revenge against Parthia, but the Parthians didn't remain passive. In 40 BC, a Parthian army under Prince Pacorus invaded the Roman East, sweeping through Syria and into Palestine. For a brief moment, it seemed like the disaster of Carrhae might be reversed, that Parthia might conquer Rome's eastern provinces rather than the other way around. The invasion was eventually repelled, but not before demonstrating that Parthia wasn't just a defensive power. It could project force into Roman territory when conditions were right. The man who finally attempted to avenge Carrhae was Mark Antony. Mark Antony was everything Crassus had not been. Where Crassus was primarily a politician and businessman who dabbled in military command, Antony was a soldier to his core. He had served under Julius Caesar in Gaul, proving himself one of the most capable cavalry commanders of his generation. He had fought in the civil wars, commanded armies across multiple theaters, and earned a reputation for personal courage and tactical skill. He was also, by 36 BC, one of the two most powerful men in the Roman world. After Caesar's assassination and the subsequent civil wars, the Roman Empire had been divided between Antony in the east and Octavian, the future Augustus, in the west. The arrangement was always unstable. Both men knew that eventually one would have to destroy the other, but for now, they were nominally allies. Antony controlled the wealthy eastern provinces, and he had a score to settle with Parthia. The invasion of 40 BC had humiliated Rome on his watch. More importantly, a successful Parthian campaign would give him the military glory he needed to overshadow Octavian, who had no comparable military achievements. He would succeed where Crassus had failed. He would avenge Carrhae. He would conquer the East and return to Rome as the greatest general since Alexander. That was the plan, anyway. Antony's Parthian campaign of 36 BC was far more carefully prepared than Crassus's reckless adventure. He assembled a massive force. Ancient sources claim 100,000 men, though the actual number was probably somewhat smaller. The army included 16 legions, 10,000 Gallic and Spanish cavalry, and substantial contingents of allied troops from the eastern client kingdoms. More importantly, Antony chose a different route. Instead of marching directly across the Mesopotamian desert, as Crassus had done, he would invade through Armenia. The mountainous terrain would neutralize Parthian cavalry advantages. Armenian allies would provide supplies and local knowledge. He would strike at Media Atropatene, a Parthian client kingdom in what is now northwestern Iran, before driving south into the Parthian heartland. It was a sound strategy. It might even have worked. But Antony made a critical mistake. Eager to reach Media before winter, he pushed ahead with his main force while his siege train, the heavy equipment needed to capture fortified cities, followed behind with a smaller escort. The Parthians, under King Phraates IV, saw an opportunity. They ambushed the siege train, destroyed the escort force of 10,000 men, and captured or destroyed all of Antony's siege equipment. Without siege engines, Antony couldn't take fortified positions. He was stuck in hostile territory, unable to achieve his objectives as autumn turned to winter and his supplies dwindled. The retreat that followed was a nightmare. For 27 days, Antony's army marched through hostile territory, harassed constantly by Parthian horse archers, running out of food and water. The soldiers ate roots, bark, anything they could find. Men died of starvation, exposure, and Parthian arrows. Antony himself proved his quality during the retreat. He was everywhere, rallying broken units, leading counterattacks, sharing his soldiers' hardships. His personal courage kept the army together when it might have dissolved into a panicked mob. Unlike Crassus, who had collapsed psychologically at the first sign of disaster, Antony remained functional and effective under extreme pressure. But courage wasn't enough. By the time the remnants of his army staggered into Armenia, Antony had lost somewhere between 25 and 32,000 men, nearly a third of his force. It wasn't Carrhae. There was no catastrophic single defeat, no capture of eagles, no dead commander, but it was a devastating failure nonetheless. Antony tried to spin the campaign as a success, claiming he had won victories and inflicted serious damage on Parthia. No one believed him. His reputation was damaged. His position relative to Octavian was weakened. The dreams of Eastern conquest had turned to ashes. He would try again, but smaller campaigns in 34 and 33 BC achieved nothing significant. And then his conflict with Octavian exploded into open civil war, culminating in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC and Antony's subsequent suicide. The man who might have avenged Carrhae was dead. Rome would need a different approach. Octavian, now Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was not a soldier. He knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. His military talents were negligible, and his health was poor. He had won his civil wars through political skill, strategic patience, and excellent subordinates, not through personal battlefield command. But Augustus was a genius at understanding power, and he understood that Rome needed to resolve the Parthian problem without risking another Carrhae or another failed invasion. His solution was diplomacy. In 20 BC, Augustus negotiated an agreement with King Phraates IV of Parthia. The terms were straightforward. Parthia would return the Roman prisoners still surviving from Carrhae over 30 years after the battle and, most importantly, would return the captured eagles. In exchange, Rome would recognize Parthia's position in the east and abandon any immediate plans for invasion. From a strictly military perspective, this was a stalemate masquerading as a Roman victory. Augustus hadn't conquered anything. He hadn't avenged the Roman dead. He had simply gotten back some symbols and some elderly prisoners through negotiation rather than force. But Augustus was a master of propaganda, and he presented the diplomatic settlement as a triumphant vindication of Roman honor. The return of the eagles was celebrated with temples, monuments, and coins. The famous statue of Augustus from Prima Porta shows him with his arm raised in command, with a small figure at his feet representing a Parthian handing over a legionary standard. The message was clear: Rome's honor had been restored. The shame of Carrhae had been erased. There was no need for further eastern adventures. It was a brilliant piece of political theater. It was also a tacit admission that Rome couldn't actually conquer Parthia through military force. Augustus had tried to avoid war, but he had also established a pattern that would define Roman-Parthian relations for the next centuries. Endless conflict over the buffer states between the two empires, punctuated by occasional invasions that achieved temporary gains, but never permanent conquest. The struggle would continue for another 300 years. The key to understanding Roman-Parthian relations is one word: Armenia. Armenia occupied the mountainous region between Roman Anatolia and the Parthian-controlled Mesopotamia. It was strategically vital to both empires. For Rome, Armenia represented a potential invasion route into Parthia that avoided the deadly Mesopotamian desert. For Parthia, Armenia was a buffer zone that protected the empire's northwestern frontier. Neither empire was willing to let the other control Armenia, but neither empire was strong enough to hold Armenia permanently against the other's opposition. The result was an endless tug-of-war. Rome would install a friendly king in Armenia. Parthia would overthrow him and install their own candidate. Rome would invade, restore their preferred ruler, and withdraw. Parthia would do the same. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. In 36 AD, the Parthians installed a new king in Armenia, prompting Rome to respond with force. In 58 to 63 AD, the Roman general Corbulo conducted a major campaign in Armenia, capturing the Armenian capital and installing a Roman client. But the campaign ended with a negotiated settlement. Rome would choose the Armenian king, but Parthia would have the right to crown him. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and solved nothing. In 114 to 117 AD, the Emperor Trajan attempted to break the stalemate once and for all. Trajan was perhaps the most militarily aggressive emperor Rome ever produced. He had already conquered Dacia, modern Romania, adding a wealthy new province to the empire and proving himself a capable commander. Now, in his 60s, he turned his attention eastward. The pretext was, as always, Armenia. The Parthian king had installed his own nephew on the Armenian throne without Roman approval. Trajan used this as justification for a full-scale invasion. His campaign of 114 to 116 AD was the most successful Roman offensive against Parthia in history. Trajan conquered Armenia, turning it into a Roman province for the first time. He swept down into Mesopotamia, capturing the great cities of Nisibis, Babylon, and Seleucia. He occupied Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and received the submission of the Parthian king. He even reached the Persian Gulf, becoming the first Roman emperor to see that body of water. Standing on the shore, Trajan reportedly gazed out at the sea and lamented that he was too old to follow in Alexander's footsteps and continue to India. It was the high watermark of Roman expansion in the east. Never before had Rome controlled so much Parthian territory. Trajan created new provinces of Mesopotamia and Assyria. The Euphrates boundary that had defined Roman-Parthian relations for a century and a half had been shattered. And then everything fell apart. Trajan's conquests were hollow. Behind his advancing legions, the conquered territories erupted in revolt. The Jewish communities of Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and Egypt rose in rebellion. The Kitos War, one of the most destructive Jewish uprisings in history. Parthian forces counterattacked, recapturing cities Trajan had just taken. Roman garrisons were besieged and annihilated. Trajan tried to salvage the situation, personally leading counterattacks and siege operations. But his health was failing. He was 63 years old and exhausted by years of campaigning, and the strategic situation was hopeless. He had overextended. He didn't have the troops to garrison his new conquests while also fighting multiple revolts. In August of 117 AD, Trajan died at the town of Selinus in southeastern Turkey. On his way back to Rome, his deathbed adoption of Hadrian as his successor may have been genuine, or it may have been fabricated by the empress and the new emperor's allies. Either way, Hadrian became emperor and he immediately abandoned Trajan's conquests. The provinces of Mesopotamia and Assyria were given up. Roman forces withdrew to the Euphrates. Armenia was returned to client kingdom status. Everything Trajan had fought for was surrendered within months of his death. Hadrian was no coward, and he wasn't indifferent to military glory. He simply recognized what Trajan, in his final desperate months, had discovered. Rome couldn't hold Mesopotamia. The reasons were fundamental, and they would doom every subsequent Roman attempt to conquer Parthia. Why couldn't Rome conquer Parthia? The first and most obvious answer is geography. The Parthian heartland lay beyond the great deserts of Mesopotamia, across some of the most challenging terrain in the ancient world. Roman armies could march into this region, but they couldn't stay. Supply lines stretched 400s of miles across hostile territory. Water sources were scarce and controlled by the enemy. The heat was brutal, the distances enormous, the logistics nightmarish. Rome had conquered many distant lands, but those conquests had generally been supported by sea power. Roman ships could supply armies in Spain, North Africa, Greece, and the Levant. But there was no maritime route to Parthia. Everything had to come overland across the deserts, vulnerable to interdiction by Parthian cavalry. The Romans called Mesopotamia the graveyard of legions, and they weren't wrong. The second reason was the Parthian military system. As Carhae had demonstrated, Roman heavy infantry was poorly matched against Parthian cavalry on open ground. The legions were designed for close combat, for shield walls and sword work, for grinding attrition battles where discipline and endurance would prevail. But they couldn't force the Parthians to fight on those terms. Parthian horse archers could simply refuse battle, falling back before Roman advances, harassing supply lines, waiting for the invaders to exhaust themselves. Parthian cataphracts could strike when and where they chose, shattering weakened Roman formations before disappearing back into the vastness of Asia. Rome did adapt, adding more cavalry to its eastern armies, developing tactics to counter horse archers, learning from its defeats, but it never fully solved the problem. The fundamental mismatch remained. The third reason was political. The Parthian Empire was structured very differently from Rome. Where Rome was a centralized state with a professional bureaucracy and a standing army directly controlled by the emperor, Parthia was a feudal confederation. The great noble families, the 7 clans, held enormous power. Provincial governors and client kings operated with substantial autonomy. The central government was relatively weak. This meant that conquering Parthia required more than defeating the Parthian king and capturing his capital. It required subduing dozens of semi-independent lords, each with their own armies, their own fortresses, their own resources. Even when Roman armies achieved spectacular victories, the Parthian system regenerated itself. New armies appeared, resistance continued. Rome's style of conquest, decisive military victory followed by administrative integration, simply didn't work against this kind of enemy. The fourth reason was the nature of the Roman Empire itself. Rome's military power was not infinite. The legions were spread across thousands of miles of frontier, from Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Any major commitment in the east meant weakening defenses elsewhere. And there were always threats elsewhere: Germanic tribes on the Danube and Rhine, unrest in the provinces, civil wars, and succession crises. Trajan could conquer Mesopotamia, but holding it meant permanently stationing multiple legions in a distant, hostile region where they would face constant guerrilla warfare and supply difficulties. The opportunity cost was enormous. Those legions couldn't be defending Dacia or patrolling the Rhine. Every Roman emperor had to make choices about where to concentrate resources. And again, they concluded that the costs of conquering Parthia outweighed the benefits. The pattern established by Trajan and Hadrian repeated itself with depressing regularity. In 161 to 166 AD, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a Parthian invasion of Armenia triggered another Roman response. The general Aridius Cassius conducted a successful campaign, capturing Seleucia and Ctesiphon once again. But once again, the Romans withdrew after their victory. And this time, they brought something back with them: the Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, which devastated the empire for the next 15 years. In 197 to 198 AD, the Emperor Septimius Severus invaded Parthia, again capturing Ctesiphon, again achieving spectacular military success. He created a new province of Mesopotamia smaller than Trajan's version, limited to the northern region around Nisibis, and actually managed to hold it. But the conquest was incomplete. The new province was a military burden, and Parthia remained unconquered beyond the new frontier. Severus's son, Caracalla, launched another eastern campaign into 16 to 217 AD, hoping to emulate Alexander the Great and conquer the entire Persian world. He was assassinated by his own officers before the campaign could really begin. His successor, Macrinus, was defeated by the Parthians at the Battle of Nisibis and forced to pay a massive indemnity to secure peace. Just centuries after Carrhae, Rome was still fighting Parthia, and Rome still hadn't won. But something else was happening in those 2 centuries, something that would eventually resolve the Roman-Parthian stalemate in the most unexpected way possible. Parthia was dying. The same decentralized political structure that made Parthia so hard to conquer also made it vulnerable to internal conflict. The great noble families competed for influence. Provincial governors plotted against the king. Succession disputes tore the realm apart. By the early 3rd century AD, Parthia was exhausted by centuries of war with Rome and weakened by internal divisions. The Arsacid dynasty that had ruled since Arsaces had founded the kingdom nearly 500 years earlier was losing its grip. Into 24 AD, a Persian vassal king named Ardashir rebelled against his Parthian overlords. Within 2 years, he had defeated the last Arsacid king and established a new dynasty, the Sasanians. The Parthian Empire was no more, but Rome's problems in the east were far from over, because the Sasanian Empire would prove to be an even more dangerous enemy than the Parthians had ever been. The Sasanians were different from the Parthians in crucial ways. Where Parthia had been a loose confederation, the Sasanian Empire was centralized and bureaucratic. Where Parthia had been content with defensive wars and buffer zones, the Sasanians were ideologically aggressive, claiming to be the rightful heirs of the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire and demanding the return of all territories Persia had ever ruled, including Roman Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. Where the Parthians had been formidable, the Sasanians were terrifying. The Roman-Sasanian wars that followed would be even more destructive than the Roman-Parthian conflicts. Roman emperors would be captured. Valerian in 260 AD, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Cities would be sacked, territories would change hands again and again. But that's a story for another time. What matters for our purposes is this: Rome never conquered Parthia. Despite 3 centuries of trying, despite some of the most capable generals and emperors in Roman history, despite military resources that dwarfed anything Parthia could match, Rome could not subjugate its eastern rival. The Parthian Empire ended not through Roman conquest, but through internal revolution. And the empire that replaced it would continue the struggle until both Rome and Persia exhausted themselves, leaving the way open for the Arab conquests that would transform the region forever. The fall of the Parthian Empire into 24 AD might seem like it should have been good news for Rome. After all, Rome's greatest eastern enemy had just been overthrown. The Arsacid dynasty that had humiliated Crassus, defeated Antony, and frustrated Trajan was gone. Surely this presented an opportunity, a chance to finally achieve what generations of Roman commanders had failed to accomplish. Instead, things got worse. The Sasanian Empire that replaced Parthia was, in many ways, everything the Parthians had not been. Where the Parthians had been content with a defensive posture, occasionally raiding Roman territory, but generally accepting the Euphrates as a boundary, the Sasanians were aggressively expansionist. They claimed to be the heirs of the ancient Achaemenid Persians, the empire of Cyrus and Darius that Alexander had conquered, and they demanded the restoration of all territories that had ever belonged to Persia. This included most of Rome's eastern provinces. The founder of the Sasanian dynasty, Artashir I, immediately began probing Roman defenses. His son, Shapur I, would go much further. In a series of campaigns between 240 and 60 AD, Shapur inflicted devastating defeats on Roman armies, captured dozens of cities, and achieved something no Parthian king had ever accomplished. He took a Roman emperor prisoner. In 260 AD, the Emperor Valerian led an army against Shapur and was catastrophically defeated near the city of Edessa. Valerian himself was captured, the only Roman emperor ever taken alive by a foreign enemy. He would die in captivity, and according to Persian sources, his stuffed body was displayed in a Sasanian temple as a trophy for centuries afterward. Roman sources tried to spin the disaster, claiming that Valerian was captured through treachery during negotiations rather than in battle. It didn't matter. The humiliation was complete. The crisis of the 3rd century that followed, with Rome fragmenting into competing empires, emperors rising and falling in rapid succession, the economy collapsing, and the frontiers crumbling, was not caused solely by the Sasanian threat. But the Persian Wars contributed to and exacerbated Rome's internal problems, draining resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Rome eventually recovered from the 3rd century crisis. The Emperor Diocletian reformed the imperial system, and Constantine reunified the empire under Christian rule. The 4th century saw a Roman revival with stronger central government, reformed armies, and renewed confidence. But the eastern frontier remained a bleeding wound. The wars with Sasanian Persia continued throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Sometimes Rome had the advantage. Sometimes Persia did. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Fortresses were built, destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again. Millions died. Treasuries were emptied. Generations of soldiers spent their lives in an endless struggle that neither side could win. The Emperor Julian, the last pagan emperor, the brilliant philosopher-soldier who attempted to reverse Constantine's Christianization of the empire, died in 363 AD during a failed invasion of Persia. He had achieved initial success, pushing deep into Mesopotamia, but was killed by a spear during a skirmish while his army was retreating. The campaign collapsed, and his successor was forced to surrender Roman territory to buy peace. It was Carrhae and Trajan and Antony all over again. Roman armies could invade Persia. They could win battles, capture cities, penetrate deep into enemy territory. But they couldn't stay, they couldn't hold, they couldn't win. The pattern persisted for 3 more centuries. The final Great Roman-Persian War, fought between 602 and 628 AD, saw both empires expend their last reserves of strength in a catastrophic conflict. The Sasanian Emperor Khosrau II conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, briefly recreating the ancient Persian Empire of Darius. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius counterattacked, eventually defeating Persia and recovering the lost territories. Both empires were exhausted. Both were shadows of their former selves, and then the Arabs came. Within 20 years of the end of the Roman-Persian War, Arab armies, inspired by the new religion of Islam, conquered the entire Sasanian Empire and stripped Byzantium of its richest provinces. The centuries of Roman-Persian conflict had weakened both powers to the point where neither could resist this new threat. The struggle that had begun at Carrhae in 53 BC ended not with Roman victory or Persian victory, but with both empires being swept away by forces neither had anticipated. So what does all of this mean? What can we learn from Rome's 3-century failure to conquer first Parthia and then Sasanian Persia? The first lesson is about the limits of military power. Rome possessed the most effective military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The legions had conquered the entire Mediterranean basin, defeated every enemy from Britain to Egypt, and created an empire that would define Western civilization for millennia. Roman military discipline, Roman engineering, Roman logistics, these were genuine achievements that represented the pinnacle of ancient military science. And yet, against Parthia, none of it was enough. The Parthians weren't better soldiers than the Romans. Man for man, the legionaries were probably more skilled, more disciplined, more capable of sustained effort. But the Parthians had designed their military system to exploit Roman weaknesses, and they fought on terrain that maximized their advantages. Military power is not absolute. It exists in relationship to specific enemies, specific terrain, specific circumstances. An army that is invincible in one context may be helpless in another. The Romans discovered this at Carrhae, and they never fully solved the problem. This lesson has echoed through history. The British Empire, at the height of its power, couldn't subdue Afghanistan. The United States, with the most powerful military in human history, couldn't pacify Vietnam or, later, Afghanistan again. Military superiority is not the same as the ability to conquer and hold territory against a determined resistance. The second lesson is about the importance of political structure. Rome conquered many kingdoms by defeating their armies and capturing their capitals. Once the central authority was destroyed, resistance typically collapsed. Local elites made their peace with Roman rule, the population adapted, and the new province was integrated into the imperial system. This approach didn't work against Parthia because Parthia didn't have the kind of centralized structure that could be destroyed in a single blow. The Parthian Empire was a network of semi-autonomous kingdoms, noble families, and client states held together by dynastic loyalty and mutual interest rather than bureaucratic control. When Roman armies defeated the Parthian king and captured his capital, the system didn't collapse. The nobles raised new armies. The client kings continued to resist. The empire regenerated itself from its decentralized components. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in military history. Decentralized, networked resistance is extraordinarily difficult to defeat through conventional military means. You can win every battle and still lose the war because there's no single point of failure, no capital to capture, no king whose surrender ends the conflict. The Parthians understood this intuitively. Their political structure wasn't designed to resist Roman conquest. It evolved for other reasons, but it had that effect nonetheless. The third lesson is about sustainability and resources. Rome was a wealthy empire, but its resources were not infinite. The legions had to be paid, fed, equipped, and replaced. The wars in the East consumed enormous quantities of money, materiel, and manpower that could have been used elsewhere. Every emperor who launched a major Parthian campaign had to weigh the potential gains against the certain costs. Conquering Mesopotamia might bring glory and plunder, but it also meant stationing multiple legions in a distant, hostile region indefinitely. Those legions couldn't be defending the Rhine or the Danube. Those resources couldn't be spent on other priorities. Again and again, Roman leaders concluded that the costs outweighed the benefits. Augustus chose diplomacy over war. Hadrian abandoned Trajan's conquests. Even emperors who achieved military success in the East typically withdrew rather than attempting permanent occupation. This wasn't cowardice or lack of ambition, it was rational calculation. The Roman Empire had many frontiers and many threats. Concentrating overwhelming force in the East meant accepting vulnerability elsewhere. The strategic math simply didn't work out. Empires are not infinite. They have limits of money, limits of manpower, limits of attention. The great temptation of empire is to believe that one more campaign, one more conquest, one more effort will solve the problem. The great danger is overextension, spreading resources so thin that the whole system becomes fragile. Trajan succumbed to this temptation. He conquered Mesopotamia, but he couldn't hold it. The effort exhausted Rome and contributed to the instability that would plague the empire for the rest of the 2nd century. The fourth lesson is about the nature of victory itself. What would Roman victory over Parthia have actually looked like? Suppose, counterfactually, that Rome had managed to conquer and hold Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. Suppose the Parthian Empire had been destroyed and its territories incorporated into the Roman provincial system. What then? Rome would have acquired a vast new territory with a hostile population, unfamiliar terrain, and completely different cultural traditions. Governing this territory would have required massive military commitments, garrisons in every city, patrols on every road, a permanent state of occupation warfare. The economic value of these territories, while significant, probably wouldn't have justified the costs. Unlike Egypt or Spain or North Africa, Mesopotamia wasn't easily connected to Mediterranean trade networks. The distances were vast, the logistics challenging, the integration with the rest of the empire problematic, and beyond Parthia lay. What? More steppe nomads, more distant kingdoms, more enemies who would resist Roman expansion. The Parthians had spent centuries fighting Central Asian nomads on their eastern frontier. If Rome replaced Parthia, Rome would inherit those problems. There's a reason that Alexander's successors couldn't hold his eastern conquests. There's a reason that every empire that has tried to control Central Asia has eventually failed. The region is too vast, too difficult, too far from the centers of power that could project force into it. Perhaps Rome was wise not to conquer Parthia. Perhaps the failure was actually success in disguise, a recognition, however reluctant, that some victories aren't worth winning. The fifth lesson is about time and persistence. The Roman-Parthian conflict lasted for 3 centuries. The Roman-Sasanian conflict that followed lasted for another 4 centuries. 700 years of intermittent warfare from Crassus to Heraclius, and neither side ever achieved decisive victory. Modern observers sometimes imagine ancient warfare as a series of decisive battles that quickly determined outcomes. The reality was often very different. Wars could drag on 4 generations. Conflicts could persist for centuries. The ancient world was not faster or simpler than our own. It was, in many ways, even more patient. Both Rome and Parthia and later Sasanian Persia were willing to keep fighting indefinitely. Neither would accept the other's dominance. Neither would surrender its claims. The result was an equilibrium of exhaustion, a stalemate maintained by mutual bloodshed. This kind of protracted conflict has costs that compound over time. Resources that could have been invested in development were consumed by war. Populations that could have grown were diminished by casualties. Institutions that could have evolved were locked into military priorities. By the time the Arab conquests swept away both empires, Rome and Persia had spent centuries weakening each other. The final war between Heraclius and Khosrow II, fought with desperate intensity on both sides, left neither empire capable of resisting the new threat that emerged from the Arabian desert. The longest wars are not always the most successful. Sometimes, the wise course is to find a way to end the conflict before it consumes everything. There's one more lesson worth considering, and it's perhaps the most uncomfortable one. The Romans assumed they were destined to conquer the world. From the earliest days of the Republic, Roman ideology proclaimed that the gods had granted Rome dominion over all peoples. Virgil's Aeneid, written during the reign of Augustus, put it explicitly: Rome's mission was to spare the conquered and war down the proud. This sense of manifest destiny, the belief that Roman expansion was natural, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned, shaped how Romans understood their place in the world. Enemies who resisted were not legitimate opponents with their own interests and perspectives. They were obstacles to be overcome, rebels against the natural order. But the Parthians didn't see it that way. From their perspective, they were the heirs of a civilization far older than Rome's. The Persian Empire had flourished while Rome was still a collection of mud huts on the Tiber. The Parthians had their own sense of destiny, their own claims to greatness, their own reasons for refusing to submit. Neither side was willing to acknowledge the legitimacy of the other's aspirations. Both believed themselves entitled to dominance. The result was an irreconcilable conflict that could only end when one or both parties was destroyed. This is the tragedy of imperial competition. When two expansionist powers meet, and neither is willing to accept limits, the result is endless war. Not because either side is evil or irrational, but because their fundamental assumptions are incompatible. Rome couldn't conquer Parthia, but it couldn't accept a world where Parthia existed as an equal either. Parthia felt the same way about Rome, and so they fought century after century until external forces rendered the question moot. Let me return to where we began, the disaster at Carrhae. 20,000 Romans died in that desert. 10,000 more were marched away into slavery. The eagles were lost, Crassus was killed, and Rome was humiliated as it hadn't been humiliated since Hannibal. In one sense, Carrhae was an anomaly. It was the result of one man's greed and incompetence, a preventable disaster that didn't need to happen. If Crassus had been wiser, if he had listened to his advisors, if he had chosen a different route or brought adequate cavalry or simply stayed home, the battle would never have occurred. But in another sense, Carrhae revealed something fundamental about the limits of Roman power. The tactics that destroyed Crassus weren't unique to that battle. They reflected a Parthian approach to warfare that would prove consistently effective against Roman armies throughout the centuries that followed. Carrhae was a warning. Rome could have listened. Instead, it spent the next 300 years trying to prove that Carrhae was a fluke, that Roman legions could triumph in the East if only they had better leadership, better planning, better execution. They couldn't, not because the legions weren't capable, not because Roman commanders weren't skilled, but because the fundamental strategic situation favored defense over offense, Parthian mobility over Roman mass, the vastness of the East over the reach of Mediterranean power. The Romans never fully accepted this. They kept trying, kept failing, kept bleeding. And in the end, they exhausted themselves in a war they could never win. There's something almost Greek about this tragedy, a great power undone by its own virtues. Rome's strength was its relentless determination. Romans didn't quit. They didn't accept defeat. They came back from Cannae, from the Gallic sack, from every disaster that would have destroyed a lesser people. This persistence was the foundation of Roman greatness. But against Parthia, that same persistence became a weakness. The refusal to accept limits meant endless war. The determination to avenge Carrhae meant repeating Carrhae's mistakes. The belief in ultimate victory prevented the kind of strategic accommodation that might have ended the conflict on acceptable terms. Rome's greatest strength was also its greatest blind spot. Is there a way out of this trap? Can empires learn to recognize their limits before those limits destroy them? History suggests that the answer is rarely. Empires are built by people who don't accept limits, who believe that enough effort and enough resources can overcome any obstacle. Telling such people that some things can't be conquered is like telling a shark not to swim. It goes against their nature. And yet, the empires that last longest are often the ones that learn, eventually, to stop. Augustus, for all his flaws, understood that Rome couldn't expand forever. He established frontiers and told his successors to maintain them. The emperors who followed his advice, Hadrian, notably are remembered as wise. The emperors who ignored it, Trajan, Caracalla achieved spectacular short-term successes that crumbled almost immediately. The Roman-Parthian Wars ended, as all things end, not with resolution but with transformation. Parthia fell to internal revolution and was replaced by Sasanian Persia. Rome evolved into the Byzantine Empire, its center of gravity shifting eastward to Constantinople. The Arab conquests swept away the old order and created something entirely new. The cities that Crassus and Trajan and Shapur fought over are still there, some of them, anyway. The Euphrates still flows. The deserts are still vast and unforgiving. But the empires that bled each other white for 7 centuries are gone. What remains is the lesson that power has limits, that victory is not always possible, that sometimes the wise course is to recognize when a war cannot be won. Rome never learned that lesson. It kept fighting until it couldn't fight anymore. Perhaps that's the most Roman thing of all. When we talk about Rome, we usually talk about its conquests. The legions marching through Gaul, the roads stretching from Scotland to Syria, the civilization that shaped the Western world for 2 millennia. But the Roman-Parthian Wars remind us that Roman power was never absolute. There was always an east beyond the reach of the eagles, always an enemy that couldn't be subdued, always a frontier that marked the end of Roman dominion. The Parthians, those horse archers and cataphracts, those nobles and kings, those people Rome never stopped fighting and never conquered, deserve to be remembered. Not as a footnote to Roman history, but as proof that even the mightiest empires have limits.